Have your GitHub credentials been stolen?
Hey, Karen, I understand you have a story to talk about pertaining to some stolen GitHub accounts.
That's right, Mike. Actually, this story reminded me a little bit of what Stan was talking about in terms of these code repositories like GitHub. In this case, they were actually stealing, using phishing campaigns to get access to the GitHub site, the user accounts, and actually stealing all of their code that they were doing. So it's unlike just stealing their money in terms of Bitcoin, they're actually downloading the code. And what's really interesting, a couple of accounts is, you know, we would think that people who are tech savvy and use GitHub wouldn't necessarily fall for these email phishing campaigns, but indeed they were. And they were fairly clever in the way they were done, like all phishing campaigns. And they were basically taking them to an alternate login page. And what was really a little even scarier than others was that even if you had two-factor authentication turned on with your account, that actually, because you'd done that and they were taking you to an alternate login page, that they were actually stealing your two-factor authentication. So that wasn't even stopping this. And basically, they stole the user credentials. They were using them later on. They were just the normal stuff that happens when this occurs, where they were able to go back in, they were able to change people's passwords later on, and basically create quite the problem in terms of GitHub, and obviously being able to steal and upload whatever it is that they wanted to those repositories. And it's not clear the way this article was written whether there was this extended impact besides their own libraries. But as we know, is, you know, that GitHub libraries are shared, and so it didn't really talk about what additional malware might have been then uploaded to somebody's library and then spread. But I was thinking about that, that in fact this was sounded like a pretty serious impact, and that people really needed to take some serious look at what was going on with their own GitHub accounts. One of the things they said was actually the best solution here is to use a password manager. Obviously, everybody, they said, go back, change your passwords, but to use a password manager, and if you were obviously getting redirected to a different login page, it would have worked, and that would have been a signal for you that that something was indeed wrong, and you were being phished. Oh, and one other point that I thought was really interesting, they were using things like Bitly to shorten the URL so that people weren't even seeing an odd URL that they were being redirected to. So I think some very interesting and social engineering here to hide what they were doing. Again, the recommendation here is using a password manager. But I did also think that the fact that two-factor authentication wasn't even stopping this was another additional point that we seem to think that's something that we can always count on, two-factor authentication, and it's just not true. So we used to, again, defense in depth, lots of different options here, but that we need to think about in this case. But very interesting case and scary, I thought.
You know, when I started my career in cybersecurity, I always thought to be the best, I had to know how to reverse engineer every weird architecture that's out there. But what I've come to learn over the last like 15 years is low-tech approaches to hacking, they really work very well, and sometimes even better than knowing everything there is to know about some obscure architecture, or exactly how x86 works, or exactly how buffer overflows work. Phishing campaigns and social engineering, people really do fall for that. It's really easy to take advantage. People are busy or they're not paying attention, like you mentioned, having legitimate looking links. like Bitly, it can really trick people and disclose their stuff. But another thing that's interesting to me, just thinking about like 15 years ago, back in the day, hacking, I feel like at least was like you know some crazy thing about this malware or buffer overflow exploit or something like that. Um, but now it seems like the adversaries, they're exploiting this like web of trust. So like in order to hack you, I might not directly go after you. I might figure out like, who do you trust? Oh, you trust this person on GitHub and the code that they put out there or that they develop. I'm gonna go after that person instead. So I think this is I think we've been seeing this kind of shift in general, and for sure, really advanced adversaries have always been taking advantage of things like that. But it seems to me that these days you hear about it like a lot more, like with this Ruby Gems story or this GitHub story. It's like you're really taking advantage of the trust people have in someone else and really hacking that trust so much more than the individual person you might be going after. Very interesting. Very interesting just to think about that.
Yeah, anytime you have a control that's predicated on a human being 100% accurate, you're going to see failures. It's always easier because of that to undermine the human component of the people, process, and technology kind of triad than the others necessarily. But a couple of things to keep in mind with this story: people will hard code in API keys, passwords, credentials, things like that into some of these coding projects. Now, it's not a recommended practice, but it does happen. So aside from the risk of intellectual property loss, which is clear, and identifying subsequently exploitable vulnerabilities inside that intellectual property, which could be exploited later, you also have the idea that, credentials beyond those that were phished could have also been disclosed. So really, the idea of using a password manager is fine, but that really is only part of the issue here, only part of the challenge that organizations who fell victim to this are going to need to address. And then there is, of course, the potential for credential reuse by the accounts that are being phished. So did that developer use those same credentials on a different cloud service? Did that credential also get used for the extranet or the HR payroll system that might be outsourced to AEP or somebody like that? So there's a number of issues here when you start to look at these stories, and it becomes really ugly really quickly. And so making sure that you have robust password controls in place and that you're leveraging things like single sign-on or CASBs or other types of technologies that would allow you to go to one place and reset that credential so that it can be quickly reset across all of those different services, and that you're not potentially leaving an exposure out there, is important for organizations to think about.
Yes, I would say
Yeah.
also encouraging people. I think GitHub supports like two-factor authentication as well through different authenticator apps. So I would encourage people who are kind of worried about this to enable that on their accounts. It can really make it more secure. And if somebody is trying to take ownership of your account, you'll at least get these authentications. Like, hey, somebody's trying to do something. You should at least be aware. Maybe you could take some action potentially.
Yeah.
One other thing that you mentioned, Karen, about Bitly, I don't know, this is like a well-known trick or not. If you add a plus to the end of a Bitly link, it'll show you where it'll redirect you before taking you there. So for those of us who are like super paranoid and have their conspiracy theory hat on, that they're always getting phished, just putting that little plus at the end of the Bitly link will make sure that you see where you get redirected before you go there.
That's a really good tip. Absolutely. But obviously they went through a lot of trouble, because I don't think that's not always the case that they do that. So to try to hide that. But, they're dealing with people who are a little bit more savvy. So I think they had to cover their tracks. It wasn't just your grandmother who just got an email or something that told her to change her password on her bank account or something. So yeah, I think that's another really good point. And the multi-factor authentication from a different, a third party is, I think, also a really good recommendation for this.